The heavy oak door stood between two worlds that should never have touched. On one side, marble floors reflected candlelight in a mansion where silence itself seemed expensive. On the other, a woman's trembling fist raised once more, her knuckles raw from knocking, her body swaying with the last remnants of strength she possessed. In her arms, a child whimpered, not with the robust cry of a healthy infant, but with the weak mewling of starvation that any mother recognizes as the sound of approaching death. She had walked 17 miles through winter rain. Her shoes, if you could call them that, had disintegrated somewhere around mile 12. The hem of her only dress dragged mud and leaves, heavy with the weight of her journey. She'd passed 3 villages where doors had closed in her face, where windows had shuddered at her approach. Desperation has an odor, they say. It clings to your clothes like smoke, announces your arrival like a bell tolling for the condemned. Inside the mansion, Marcus Aldridge, the Marquess of Thornfield, sat alone in his study. 5 years a widower, 5 years of existing in a house too large for one man's grief. The servants had long since learned to move like ghosts through the corridors, careful not to disturb the silence he'd built around himself like a fortress. His wealth could buy anything except the one thing he wanted: to hear Catherine's laugh echo through these halls again, to watch her hands arrange flowers in the blue vase she loved, to argue with her about something meaningless and wonderful. The knocking came again, insistent, desperate, not the polite rap of a tradesman or the confident knock of a peer. This was the sound of someone who had nothing left to lose. Thomas, the butler, moved to answer it, but something made Marcus rise from his chair. Perhaps it was intuition. Perhaps it was the peculiar persistence of that knocking. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. When he opened the door himself, an act so unusual that Thomas froze mid-step, Marcus saw her. A phantom of rain and mud and determination. Her eyes, though sunken with hunger, burned with something fiercer than desperation. It was the ferocious love of a mother who would walk through hell itself if it meant one more breath for her child. He saw the infant barely visible in the soaked blanket. He saw her lips moving, forming words that her voice was too weak to carry. And then Marcus Aldridge, Marquis of Thornfield, a man who hadn't shed a tear since they lowered Catherine into the ground, felt something crack inside his chest. Hot tears spilled down his face as he stepped aside, pulling the door open wide. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but she understood. Desperation had knocked on privilege's door, and for once, for this miraculous once, that door had opened. This is the story of what happened next. A tale of 2 broken people who found in each other's brokenness not weakness, but the raw materials of redemption. The mansion had 43 rooms. Marcus had counted them one sleepless night, wandering the corridors like a ghost in his own home. 43 rooms, and he occupied perhaps 5 of them with any regularity. The rest stood frozen in time, preserved like artifacts of a life that had ended abruptly on a Tuesday afternoon when the doctor had emerged from the bedroom, his face saying everything his words didn't need to. Catherine had wanted children. God, how she'd wanted them. She'd converted the Eastern Wing's sunniest room into a nursery before they'd even conceived. Yellow walls because yellow is hope, she'd said, painting swatches herself despite the servants' protests. Curtains with dancing rabbits. A rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. A crib carved from oak, its posts topped with angels that Marcus had commissioned from a craftsman in Vienna. That room had remained locked for 5 years. Marcus couldn't bear to open it, couldn't bear to pack it away. The dust gathered on Catherine's hope like snow on a grave. Sometimes passing that door late at night, he swore he could hear phantom laughter. The imaginary sounds of the children they'd never had. It was torture. It was all he had left of her dreams. The irony wasn't lost on him. He possessed wealth that could feed a village for a year. A bloodline traced back to the Norman conquest. Property spanning 3 counties. Yet he lived like a monk in a monastery of his own making. Eating meals he didn't taste. Reading books whose words evaporated from his memory the moment his eyes left the page. Grief had made him a miser, but not of money, of life itself. His peers had stopped inviting him to their gatherings. At first they'd been understanding, sympathetic even, but sympathy has a shelf life in society. After the first year, the invitations came less frequently. After the second, they stopped altogether. He became that tragic figure people discussed in hushed tones at parties. Poor Aldridge still hasn't recovered. Such a waste. He's only 32. Thomas, his butler, was perhaps the only person who truly saw him anymore. The man had served the family for 40 years, had watched Marcus grow from boy to man to this hollow version of both. He brought meals Marcus didn't eat. He drew baths Marcus forgot to take. He maintained the fiction that this was still a functioning household and not a mausoleum, where one mourner happened to still have a pulse. But something had been shifting in Marcus lately, though he couldn't have named it. A restlessness, an awareness of time passing in a way he hadn't felt since Catherine's death. He was only 32, but he felt ancient. His reflection in the mirror showed a man graying prematurely, lines carved deep around eyes that had forgotten how to see joy. He wondered sometimes if this was all there was, this endless procession of empty days, this waiting for nothing in particular. The night the peasant woman knocked, Marcus had been contemplating the gun in his study drawer. Not seriously, or maybe seriously, he wasn't sure anymore. He'd been holding Catherine's favorite book, a volume of poetry so worn the spine had split. Her handwriting decorated the margins, little observations, questions, arguments with the poets. It made him feel close to her and impossibly far from her all at once. When he heard that knocking, insistent, desperate, refusing to be ignored, something in him responded before his mind could catch up. Later, he would wonder if Catherine had sent her somehow. If the universe in its mysterious calculus had decided he'd grieved long enough. If desperation recognizes desperation, even when one wears silk and the other wears rags. The 43 rooms had been empty for so long. But empty isn't the same as full of nothing. Sometimes empty is just space waiting to be filled. A cup can only be refilled once you've poured out the stale water. A room can only be lived in again once you've opened the door. That night, Marcus opened a door. He had no idea he was opening them all. Her name was Eleanor, though it had been months since anyone had used it. She'd become invisible, another faceless poor woman in a country full of them. Just 6 months ago, she'd had a name, a husband, a small plot of land that grew enough to keep them fed. She'd had a future modest but real. She'd had dignity. The winter had been cruel, but winters were always cruel to people like them. They'd survived before. But then Thomas, her husband, had taken sick. It started as a cough, the kind every farmer gets from working in cold rain. But this cough had teeth. It burrowed into his lungs and nested there. She'd made every poultice she knew. She'd traded their last chicken for medicine from the village. She'd prayed until her knees bled on the chapel floor. He died on a Monday. The ground was too frozen to bury him properly. The baby, James, was only 2 months old. Thomas never got to see him smile, never heard his first laugh. Eleanor had buried her husband in shallow ground behind their cottage, marking the spot with a wooden cross she carved herself because they couldn't afford the priest's fee for consecrated ground. The landlord came 3 days later. The rent was due. She had nothing. He was not an evil man, but he was not a kind one either. He gave her a week to leave. She sold everything. Furniture her grandfather had made, her mother's wedding ring, the iron pot that had cooked 10,000 meals. It bought her perhaps 3 weeks of survival if she was careful, if she was lucky. But luck had abandoned Eleanor somewhere between her husband's last breath and the landlord's knock. The money ran out faster than she'd calculated. Bread cost more each day. The baby needed milk she couldn't produce because her own body was starving. She watched James fade day by day, his cries growing weaker, his skin taking on that transparent quality that precedes death. She tried everything. She begged at the church. The priest gave her enough for 2 days and then reminded her that charity must be distributed fairly, that she couldn't expect special treatment. She stood in the village square with her hand out until the constable moved her along for being a public nuisance. She went to the workhouse and saw the conditions there, children crying in filth, disease spreading like wildfire through overcrowded rooms, and made an impossible choice. Better to die free than to watch her son die slowly in that hell. The decision to walk to the marquess' estate came to her like a fever dream. She'd heard stories about him, a widower who lived alone in obscene wealth, a man so rich he wouldn't notice if a few coins went missing from his purse. She had no plan beyond knocking on his door, no strategy except desperation. She didn't even know if he was in residence or if he'd turned away seekers before her. The 17-mile walk should have killed them both. Her feet bled through the remains of her shoes. The rain soaked through to her skin until she couldn't remember what dry felt like. James grew quieter with each mile. his little body cold despite being wrapped in every rag she owned. She talked to him the whole way, telling him stories about his father, about the farm they'd lost, about the future they'd have once they survived this. She talked because if she stopped, she'd realize she was walking to her death, and the mind can only tolerate so much truth. Twice, she nearly turned back. But where would she go? There was nothing behind her but closed doors and empty cupboards. At least forward held the possibility of mercy, however slim. So she walked through pain that transcended physical sensation, through despair that should have paralyzed her, propelled by the animal drive that lives in every mother, the instinct that says your child's life matters more than your own pride, your own suffering, your own life. When she finally saw the mansion, its windows glowing like promises in the dusk, she didn't feel relief. She felt terror, because this was the last door. If it closed, there were no more doors. This was the end of the line, so she knocked. And knocked. And knocked again, because stopping meant accepting death, and she wasn't ready to accept that yet. Time can fracture. One moment can split your life into before and after with the clean precision of an axe through wood. Marcus had experienced it once before when the doctor had told him Catherine was gone. Now he experienced it again, standing in his doorway, looking at this woman who was barely alive and the child who was even closer to death. He should have called for Thomas, should have summoned the housekeeper, should have maintained the proper distance between a marquis and a beggar at his door, but something short-circuited in him. Later, he'd realize it was recognition, not of her specifically, but of that look in her eyes. He'd seen it in his own mirror. It was the look of someone who'd already lost everything except the thing they were currently losing. The tears came unbidden. They shocked him as much as they shocked her. He hadn't cried at Catherine's funeral, hadn't cried when he'd packed away her clothes or when he'd found her diary, or during any of the 1,000 small deaths that grief deals after the large one. He'd thought himself incapable of tears. His capacity for them dried up like a well in drought. But seeing this woman, seeing her fierce, desperate love for her child, seeing the way she clutched him like he was the only thing in the universe worth saving, it broke something in Marcus. Or maybe it broke something open, the dam he'd built against feeling anything cracked and outpoured 5 years of unshed tears. "Come in," he managed, though his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Thomas." "Mrs. Brennan, now!" The household erupted into controlled chaos. Thomas appeared, his composure slipping for the first time in Marcus's memory. "Mrs. Brennan." The housekeeper took one look at Eleanor and snapped into the efficient mode of a woman who'd raised 7 children of her own. Suddenly there were blankets, hot water, broth, orders being given in tones that brooked no argument. Eleanor collapsed the moment she crossed the threshold, as if permission to stop walking had revoked her body's ability to stand. Mrs. Brennan caught the baby before he hit the ground. Marcus caught Eleanor, shocked by how little she weighed, how her bones felt like bird bones through the wet cloth of her dress. "Get Dr. Harrison," he ordered Thomas, his voice suddenly strong, suddenly certain. "Tell him it's urgent. Tell him I'll pay double if he's here within the hour." He carried Eleanor to the drawing room, laying her on the sofa Catherine had favored for reading. Mrs. Brennan had already unwrapped the baby, her face grave as she examined him. The child was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, but he was breathing. They'd arrived in time. Barely, but barely was enough. "Lord Aldridge," Mrs. Brennan said softly, "this child needs milk immediately, and she needs broth, careful-like. Too much too fast will shock the system." Marcus found himself nodding, taking orders in his own home and not caring one bit about the reversal. Whatever they need. Cost doesn't matter. Nothing matters except keeping them alive. He knelt beside the sofa, watching Eleanor's face. She was younger than he'd first thought. Perhaps 25, though suffering had aged her. There was a beauty beneath the dirt and exhaustion, but more than that, there was a strength. She'd walked 17 miles in the rain carrying a dying child. She'd knocked on the door of a stranger because stopping meant surrender, and she wouldn't surrender. Catherine would have liked her, he thought suddenly. Catherine, who'd fought her own illness with similar ferocity, who'd refused to die quietly, who'd raged against the unfairness of it all until the very end. Catherine, who'd told him in one of their last coherent conversations, "Don't let grief make you small, Marcus. Promise me you'll stay big enough to let new love in." He'd thought she meant romantic love. Maybe she did. But maybe she meant this too. The choice to open the door instead of closing it. The choice to let someone else's suffering matter to him when his own suffering felt like all he could carry. Looking at Eleanor and her son, Marcus realized something profound. Saving them might be the first step toward saving himself. The mansion began to wake up. It was subtle at first, the sound of Mrs. Brennan humming as she prepared broth in the kitchen, the quick footsteps of maids carrying fresh linens to the guest room where Eleanor and James had been installed. The house, which had been holding its breath for 5 years, slowly began to exhale. Dr. Harrison arrived in 47 minutes. He examined James first. Dehydration, malnutrition, the beginnings of pneumonia. "Another day and you'd be calling me for a death certificate," he said bluntly. Then Eleanor, severe malnutrition, exhaustion, infected wounds on her feet, but nothing that time and care couldn't heal. "She's young. Strong constitution beneath the suffering. She'll recover." Marcus stood in the doorway watching the doctor work, feeling useless and essential all at once. When Dr. Harrison finished, he pulled Marcus aside. "I've seen a lot of death in this job, my lord. Today I saw life win. Whatever moved you to open that door, I hope you never forget it." The first night Marcus couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing the corridors, listening to the unfamiliar sounds. Eleanor's occasional cough from the guest room, James's feeble crying when Mrs. Brennan fed him through the night, the murmur of servants who'd volunteered to take shifts watching over them. The house felt different, occupied, alive. Around 3 in the morning, he found himself outside the locked nursery. His hand trembled as he pulled the key from his pocket, the key he'd carried for 5 years without using. The lock turned with a protest. The door opened on hinges that squeaked from disuse. The room looked exactly as Catherine had left it. Dust covered everything like a shroud, but beneath it, the yellow walls still glowed hopefully in the moonlight. The rocking chair still sat by the window. The crib with its angel posts still waited for a child who would never come. Marcus walked to the crib and placed his hand on the rail. "I met someone today," he whispered to the empty room, to Catherine's ghost, to the children they'd never had. "A woman with a baby. They were dying and I couldn't let them die, Catherine. I couldn't," he cried again, but these tears felt different, cleaner somehow, like rain after a long drought. He realized he was crying for everything, for Catherine, for the children they'd never had, for Eleanor and James, for the man he'd been and the man he'd become and the man he might still be. The next morning, he ordered the nursery cleaned. Mrs. Brennan supervised the operation with brisk efficiency, though he noticed her wiping her eyes when she thought no one was watching. The staff had loved Catherine too. They'd been grieving alongside him all this time, but without permission to show it. By afternoon, the nursery gleamed. Fresh linens on the tiny bed, windows opened to let in air and light. The yellow walls seemed to glow with renewed purpose. When James was strong enough to leave Eleanor's side, he'd have a proper room. Not just any room, Catherine's room. The one she'd prepared with such hope. Eleanor woke on the 3rd day. Marcus was there when her eyes opened. Having taken to sitting in the chair by her bedside during the afternoons, she looked at him with confusion, then fear, then something like wonder as memory returned. "My baby?" Her voice was raw from disuse. "Safe, fed, improving every day. Dr. Harrison says he'll make a full recovery." She closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lids. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought we were dead." "I thought you're not dead," Marcus said firmly. "You're here. You're both here, and you'll stay here until you're strong again. I have nothing to pay you, nothing to offer in return." Marcus thought about the house breathing again, about the tears he'd finally been able to cry, about the nursery door standing open for the first time in 5 years, about how saving her life might have inadvertently saved his own. "You've already paid," he said quietly. "You just don't know it yet. Healing isn't linear. It's a dance of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, of good days followed by devastating ones, of progress that sometimes looks like regression." Eleanor and James healed their bodies first, proper food, warm beds, medical care working the slow magic of restoration. But the deeper wounds, the ones carved by loss and trauma, those would take longer. Eleanor struggled with guilt. She'd wake in the night, momentarily disoriented by the softness of the bed, the warmth of the room, and feel overwhelming shame at her comfort. Other women she'd known in poverty were still suffering. Other children were still dying. Why had she been saved when they weren't? The unfairness of it haunted her. Marcus recognized that guilt because he wore it too. His wife had died while other wives lived. He had money that could save lives. Yet how many people had suffered within miles of his estate while he'd locked himself away in grief? What right did he have to happiness when Catherine would never be happy again? They began talking during Eleanor's recovery. At first it was practical matters, her strength returning, James's progress, plans for what would come next. But gradually, in the quiet hours of afternoon when the house dozed in sunlight, their conversations deepened. "Why did you open the door?" Eleanor asked one day. "Men like you don't open doors for women like me." Marcus considered the question. "I don't know if I can explain it. Something in me recognized something in you. Desperation maybe, or determination, or the refusal to surrender even when surrender made sense. I thought you might turn me away. I thought I might die on your doorstep." "I was dying too," Marcus admitted. "Just more slowly, more comfortably, but dying nonetheless." Eleanor studied him with those sharp eyes that saw more than most. "Your wife?" "5 years ago, fever. She was gone in 3 days." He paused. "She wanted children so badly. We tried for years. Then she died, and all that hope just evaporated." "I had a husband," Eleanor said quietly. "Thomas, he was good. Not perfect, but good. He died 6 months ago. Lung sickness." Everything fell apart after that. They sat in companionable silence, two people who'd lost everything, who'd found each other at the exact moment when finding each other was the difference between life and death. James thrived. Within 2 weeks, he was a different child, pink-cheeked, round-bellied, laughing at dust motes dancing in sunlight. Marcus found himself drawn to the nursery, watching the baby discover his own hands, his own voice. Mrs. Brennan would find him there, sitting in the rocking chair with James in his arms, both of them perfectly content. "You're good with him," Eleanor observed one afternoon. "I never thought I'd have the chance to hold a child," Marcus admitted. "Catherine and I tried for so long. Every month that passed was another small death. Then she died, and I thought that part of my life was just over. He likes you. Babies know who's safe." Something shifted between them in those weeks. Not romance, not yet. Neither was ready for that. But recognition, respect. The tentative building of trust between two people who'd learned not to trust the world. Eleanor began to help around the house, despite Marcus's protests that she was a guest, not a servant. "I need to be useful," she insisted. "I can't just sit idle. It makes me feel like I'm waiting to die." She started in the library, organizing books that hadn't been touched in years. Then the drawing room, bringing life back to spaces that had been preserved like museums. The staff, initially uncertain about this peasant woman in their midst, gradually accepted her. She worked alongside them without pretension, grateful for every task. Marcus watched her bring his house back to life and realized she was doing the same for him. The frozen parts of him were thawing. He laughed for the first time in years when James grabbed his nose. He felt anger when Eleanor told him about the landlord who'd evicted her, about the priest who'd offered too little too late. He felt that was the miracle. After 5 years of numbness, he felt again. 6 weeks after that desperate knock on his door, Marcus stood in his study facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. Eleanor had recovered fully. James was healthy, thriving even. Dr. Harrison had declared them both fit, which meant it was time to discuss what came next. The practical answer was simple. Give Eleanor money, help her find a cottage, set her up with enough to live comfortably. He had the resources. She had the need. It was a clean solution, generous even. His peers would applaud his charity. The problem was that Marcus didn't want the clean solution. He wanted them to stay. Not as charity cases. Not as servants. But as what? The question had been circling his mind for days, keeping him awake at night. His feelings for Eleanor had grown into something he couldn't quite name. Not love, not yet. But the possibility of love. The willingness to love. The recognition that his heart, which he'd thought permanently closed, might be capable of opening again. But what right did he have to ask her to stay? He was a marquis. She was a peasant woman. Society would be scandalized. His peers would ostracize them both. And Eleanor, what were her feelings? Gratitude, certainly. But gratitude wasn't the foundation for anything real. He'd saved her life. That created a power imbalance that made any genuine relationship suspect. He'd asked Thomas for advice. The old butler had smiled, actually smiled, and said, "My lord, in my 40 years serving this family, I've never seen you happier than these past 6 weeks. Whatever you decide, choose the option that keeps that happiness alive." That evening, Marcus asked Eleanor to join him in the library. She came wearing one of the dresses they'd commissioned for her. Simple but well-made, blue like the summer sky. She looked healthy now, beautiful even, but it was her eyes that captivated him. They'd regained their fire, that fierce intelligence that poverty had dimmed but not destroyed. "We need to discuss your plans," Marcus began, then stopped. He'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now the careful words evaporated. "That is, I want to—" "Eleanor, I'm making a mess of this," she smiled gently. "Say what you mean, my lord. I don't want you to leave." The words tumbled out. "I know that's selfish. I know I have no right to ask you to stay. You have your own life to rebuild. But these past weeks, this house has felt like a home again. Because of you. Because of James. I've been existing in a tomb for 5 years, and you've brought me back to life." Eleanor's eyes widened. "What are you asking?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I only know I can't imagine this house without you both in it. Without James's laughter in the nursery. Without our afternoon conversations. Without—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Without someone who understands grief?" Eleanor supplied softly. "Without someone who knows what it means to lose everything and have to choose whether to keep living anyway?" "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "I've been terrified to hope for anything. Hope has been dangerous for me. Every time I've hoped for something, I've lost it. Thomas, our home, nearly lost James. I understand, but," she continued, holding up a hand, "I've also been thinking about how you opened that door when you could have kept it closed. About how you cried, which meant you let yourself feel something when you could have stayed numb. About how you held my son like he was precious when the world treats children like me as disposable." She stepped closer. "You asked what I want. I want James to grow up in a house filled with kindness. I want to stop running. I want—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want to see where this could go. Between us, if you're brave enough to try." Marcus felt something unlock in his chest. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Me too," Eleanor said, smiling through tears. "But maybe being terrified together is better than being numb alone." "Maybe it is," Marcus agreed, reaching for her hand. 6 months later, the spring sun illuminated the yellow walls of the nursery, where James took his first wobbling steps. Eleanor clapped her hands in delight while Marcus steadied the boy with gentle hands. Mrs. Brennan watched from the doorway, openly crying happy tears. The scandal had been exactly as bad as Marcus predicted. The local gentry whispered behind fans and gloved hands.
"Invitations dried up completely."
2 of his distant cousins wrote letters expressing their deep concern about the family name. Marcus read them once and threw them in the fire. Catherine would have done the same. The wedding had been small, intimate, conducted by a young priest who cared more about mercy than social conventions. Eleanor wore a dress of cream silk, simple but elegant. Marcus wept through the vows again and no longer felt ashamed of his tears. They'd learned together that tears weren't weakness. They were proof you were still alive, still willing to feel, still capable of being moved by beauty and love and grace. The estate had transformed. Where silence once reigned, now there was life. James's laughter, Eleanor's singing as she worked in the gardens she'd planted, the sounds of a household that functioned not from duty but from genuine affection. The servants had fallen in love with young James. Even stern Thomas could be found making silly faces to elicit giggles from the boy. Eleanor had proven to be remarkably capable at managing the estate's charitable works. Her understanding of poverty from the inside made her uniquely qualified to direct Marcus's wealth toward real solutions. A lending library for tenant farmers, a medical fund for emergencies, improved housing that didn't extract every penny from those who could least afford it. The same people who'd closed doors in her face now benefited from her compassion. But it was the small moments that mattered most to Marcus. Eleanor's hand finding his across the dinner table. The weight of James falling asleep on his shoulder. The sound of his wife's voice reading in the library. Their library now. The way she'd gently reorganized his life without erasing Catherine's memory, creating space for both past love and present. One evening, As they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor said, "Do you ever regret opening that door?" Marcus pulled her closer. "Every door I opened after that one, the nursery, my heart, the possibility of loving again, they all started with opening that first door. So no, never, not for a single moment." "I was so afraid you'd turn me away," Eleanor admitted. "I was afraid of everything back then," Marcus said. "Afraid of feeling, afraid of living, afraid of betraying Catherine's memory by daring to be happy again. But you taught me something important." "What's that?" "That love isn't a finite resource. Loving you doesn't mean I loved Catherine less. Opening my heart to James doesn't diminish the children Catherine and I never had. Loss and love can coexist. Pain and joy can inhabit the same heart. We're large enough to contain multitudes." Eleanor smiled, that brilliant smile that had slowly returned as she healed. "We're writing a strange story, aren't we? The Marquis and the peasant woman." "We're writing a true story," Marcus corrected, "about two people who were drowning separately and figured out how to keep each other afloat. About how desperation can be divine timing in disguise. About how sometimes the person who needs saving is the one who opens the door." James stirred in Eleanor's arms, his small hand reaching up to touch her face. She kissed his palm gently, and Marcus felt his heart expand with a sensation he'd thought lost forever. The simple, profound contentment of family. That desperate knock on a rain-soaked night had changed everything. It had brought Eleanor and James in from the cold. But more than that, it had invited Marcus back into his own life, his own home, his own capacity for love. Two broken people had collided at precisely the moment when collision was the only thing that could make them whole. The 43 rooms of the mansion no longer stood empty. They were filled with the messy, beautiful, complicated reality of life being lived fully. And if society never forgave them for crossing the boundaries between their worlds, that was society's loss. They'd found something too precious to surrender for the approval of people who'd never known true desperation, true love, or the courage it takes to open a door when closing it would be so much easier. They'd found each other, and that, Marcus thought as he watched his wife and son in the golden light, was worth every tear, every scandal, every moment of fear, worth everything.